It is a hot day under a scorching sun in the desert sands of Upper Mesopotamia, and a large Roman force of some 43,000 men marches to meet the enemy in battle. Faced with a force of only 10,000, no one would expect the enemy to put up any resistance or even dare to fight the experienced Roman legions. Despite their numerical inferiority, the cataphracts and cavalry archers decide to march forward and initiate the attack, in what would go down in history as one of the worst military disasters ever seen. But let us look at the political situation in Rome shortly before the battle. Crassus was the richest man in the entire Roman Republic, but nevertheless, his prestige and fame was inferior to that of his two allies, Caesar and Pompey, with whom he formed part of the first triumvirate. It is said that he was envious of Pompey's military triumphs, and on the other hand, Caesar was gaining military recognition for his advances in Gaul. As for Crassus, his only victories had been against Spartacus, and also his participation during the Civil War of Sulla, both events already forgotten for having occurred some 20 years earlier. The Roman was at this time about 62 years old, and it is said that he wanted to cement the military career of his son, Publius, who until then had served under Caesar at Gaul. For this reason, he turned his attention to Parthia in order to annex it to the Republic, and also because he regarded it as an easy target for conquest. However, many people in the Senate opposed this war. Among them, Cicero said that it was a nulla causa, a war without any justification. Crassus arrived in Syria in 55 BC and used his immense fortune to assimilate a large army. He began by annexing the frontier cities without obtaining major resistance. At this point, the king of Armenia, who was an ally of Rome, advised him not to invade through the desert, but to do so from Armenian territory, and that he would give him the support of some 30,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry. Strangely, the Roman refused. The reason for such a refusal of help is not known, but Crassus chose to make his military campaign across the desert. For this, he needed a guide, and so he met the Arab Ahmed bin Ariamnes, who offered to guide and accompany him with his 6,000 horsemen. Ariamnes convinced them that it would be best to march quickly during the summer, and that in this way he would achieve an early victory over the enemy troops. In doing so, there would obviously be no time to establish supply points at the various oases, and to make matters worse, the legionnaires' sandals were studded with iron, and most of their armor and equipment was metal, which would make them boil hot. Despite this, the commander chose to follow this strategy, and during the march shouted to his troops, quote, "Keep up. Do you think you are in the vineyards of Campania?" End quote. In total, his forces consisted of around 38,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, among which were some 1,000 Gallic horsemen commanded by his son Publius. The days went by and the soldiers, who had limited water reserves, were reaching the point of being completely exhausted. It was at this point that their guides surprisingly turned around and retreated, abandoning the Romans. Crassus had fallen into a trap. His guide, Ariamnes, had actually been sent by his enemy, the Parthian king Orodes II, who was aware of his plans. Everything he had told him was false, and it is said that he used flattery to get him to trust him. Crassus sent scouts to see what was ahead, and they informed him that the Parthians were marching towards them. The Roman opted to form his troops in a broad horizontal line of 3 ranks, with infantry forming the center and cavalry on the wings, to meet the impending threat. But before the formation could be completed, he changed his mind and commanded that a quadrangular formation be adopted. Crassus's generals advised him to camp to let his troops rest, as they were very exhausted. However, his son was eager to fight and convinced Crassus to give battle. The Parthian troops consisted of about 1,000 cataphracts and 9,000 horse archers. The Parthian commander, Moreira, sent his archers to attack the Roman formations, raining down an immense amount of arrows. The Roman infantry quickly adopted a shield wall formation. In this way, they would be protected against projectiles. According to Crassus, it was just a matter of waiting for the enemy to run out of arrows. But his opponents were prepared and had hundreds of camels with which they were able to resupply their archers. Some historians describe the arrows penetrating the Roman shields and nailing those to the limbs of the Roman infantry, and also their feet to the ground. At the same time, the cataphracts charged against the infantry and then retreated without engaging in battle. This was a type of combat that the Romans were not accustomed to, let alone prepared to face. As the number of wounded increased and the troops bled, Crassus sent out small groups on several occasions to attack the archers, but their efforts were futile, and they had to retreat in a hail of arrows. The Romans had scorpions, also called ballista, which they used to bring down several of the enemy troops, but the impact was very limited, and the engineers in charge of these weapons were quickly pierced by the countless arrows. Realizing the gravity of the situation, the Roman commander sent his son with 1,300 Gallic cavalry, 500 archers, and 4,000 legionaries to force the enemy to retreat. The plan seemed to work initially, and Publius managed to force a large part of the attackers to retreat and proceeded to advance against them. But it was just another trap, and once the main Roman force was out of sight, they were surrounded by cavalry archers on all sides. Some of the Roman horsemen managed to escape to warn Crassus of the terrible situation and call for help. Publius and his men were pinned down and had no choice but to retreat to a nearby hill. Finding himself surrounded and again being pierced one after another by the great rain of arrows, Publius preferred to die with his men rather than abandon them and try to escape, and committed suicide. Only 500 men of the nearly 5,000 who were under his command were taken as prisoners. Meanwhile, only one of the emissaries managed to reach the main force and inform Crassus of his son's desperate plight. Crassus decided to march to save his son, but the hope that Publius was alive was soon exhausted, as an enemy horseman showed the legions the head of Crassus's son stuck on a spear. Total panic seized the legionaries, who were huddled behind their shields, several of which were made of wood and began to shatter. Such was the number of projectiles with which they were being attacked. Eventually night fell, and the Parthians retreated. Roman casualties numbered in the thousands, with many men terribly wounded and pinned to the ground, unable to remove their armor and shields from their bodies. Crassus ordered a camp to be set up on the same site, but they could not wait for the next day, and made the decision to abandon the area and leave all the wounded behind in hopes of retreating to the nearest city of Carrhae. It is said that 4,000 soldiers were left to their fate. Walking through the darkness, a total of 2,500 men became separated from the group and lost the entire trail. None of them knew the terrain, nor were they sure if they were going in the right direction. Before long, they were rounded up and mostly slaughtered. Only 20 were taken prisoner. The next morning, the Parthians stormed the original position, where the wounded numbered in the thousands, and all were executed. Crassus miraculously managed to reach Carrhae, and as the sun rose, Surenna sent them a message offering terms of negotiation. The Roman leader refused to talk, but his troops forced him under threat of mutiny. Surenna said he would allow all the Romans to withdraw safely to Syria, but on condition that Rome recognized the Euphrates River as the border. During the negotiations, the situation got out of control, and both groups began to fight each other. Crassus was beheaded on the spot, and all those with him were killed. It is said that soon after, melted gold was poured down his throat, as a mockery of his reputation for being greedy. The rest of the army enclosed in the settlement tried to flee, but most of them were captured. The result was undoubtedly disastrous, and went down in history as one of the worst defeats suffered by Rome. Enemy casualties had been minimal, and it was difficult to understand how a force 4 times smaller was able to decisively annihilate the invaders. Undoubtedly, this battle has served as an example of the terrible consequences of underestimating the enemy and making completely absurd and wrong decisions on more than one occasion. It was a senseless war carried out solely by a man who was the richest in the whole republic and who, not content with that, wanted to have more and more. His son Publius had a great future ahead of him in military and political terms, but all of that ended up buried under the desert sands. On the other hand, The leader of the Parthian force who defeated the Romans, Moreira, achieved great fame with his victory, but soon after, King Orodes ordered his execution because he considered his excessive popularity to be a threat to his power. We hope you liked the story we have seen today, and that you leave us a like and share our video in the various social networks to help us get more subscribers. Don't forget to leave a comment to confirm that you have survived the massacre and that you will be with us in future challenges. Thank you very much for being here, and see you later.